Republic Act 9147, otherwise known as Wildlife Resources Conservation and Protection Act. RA 9147 Series 2001 was approved on July 30, 2001. It is the policy of the state providing for the conservation and protection of wildlife resources and their habitats, for the appropriation of funds, and for other purposes. We will define first what the word wildlife is, since ito din naman ang pag-uusapan natin all throughout the presentation. Now, based on the definition of terms of the Act, wildlife is a wild forms of varieties of flora and fauna in all developmental stages, such as eggs, pupae, seedlings, including those which are in captivity or being bred or propagated. Meaning, this wildlife that this act covers not only refers to the non-domesticated species of flora and fauna. By the way, flora means plants and fauna means animals, but also to the species that are in captivity, being propagated, or in conservation facilities. Now, moreover, the protection and conservation of this wildlife does not limit only to the adult stage of such species, but as well as to all its developmental stages. In the pursuit of this policy, this act shall have the following objectives. First is to conserve and protect wildlife species and their habitats to promote ecological balance and enhance biological diversity. This means that the act aims to protect floral and faunal species as the human population encroaches on their resources and habitats. So as we all know that human population has grown exponentially over the past few years, and it even continues to rapidly grow. So this means that the natural resources are being consumed faster than ever by the people in the country. Then this growth and development consequently endangers the habitats and existence of various types of wildlife. Now the second objective is to regulate the collection and trade of wildlife. Actually, wildlife entails different set of economic dynamics. Based on reports, the legal global wildlife trade is worth roughly $300 billion. Now these wildlife are traded for skins, leather goods, souvenirs, food, traditional medicines, or even as pets. Now sadly, itong mga endangered animals and plants ngayon ang mas nagiging target ng wildlife crime because of their rarity and increased economic value. That is why in the Philippines, the regulation of wild flora and fauna follows the system and standards established by the CITES, or the Convention International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna. To give you a brief detail on this, it is a multilateral treaty regulating the international trade of flora and fauna, and since the Philippines naman is one of the countries who signed to be part of the treaty, it has now a responsibility in the implementation on its commitments in regulating wildlife trade in the country. Now, itong si CITES has a list of red flag species that categorizes the wildlife, of course based on the conservation status of the IUCN, or the International Union for Conservation of Nature. These will serve as the guidebook or list natin para ma-identify yung conservation status ng mga collected or traded wildlife. Kung ito ba ay endangered, critically endangered, or least concern. Also, the Philippines had established a national list of threatened flora or fauna species that are endemic to the country. Of course, again, based on the best scientific and international accepted criteria for classification of conservation status ng IUCN. Ngayon, makikita naman yung list ng threatened plants species that are endemic to the country dito sa DNR Administrative Order or DAO 2017-11. At yung list of threatened animals naman ay nasa DAO 2019-09. Our third objective is to pursue with due regard to the national interest the Philippines' commitment to international conventions, protection of wildlife, and their habitats. Now, the Philippines has entered or signed to several multilateral environmental and natural resources agreements. These may be in the form of treaty, convention, or protocol, which will address global environmental issues na ini-implement ng bansa through giving mandates sa DNR or other concerned agencies. Now, example ng ating mga treaties or agreements internationally is yung na-mention natin kanina, yung CITES, yung Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, which regulates international wildlife trade. Meron din tayong Ramsar Convention wherein it focuses on the rehabilitation activities and protection of wetlands. We also have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Biodiversity Convention, Migratory Bird Convention, treaties on protected areas around the world, and a lot more. And the last objective of RA 9147 is to initiate or support scientific studies on the conservation of biological diversity. Now, the government believes that the breakthroughs and results from science-based researches are the important tools to empower government, corporations, policymakers, or even the local communities to develop tailored strategies and timely science-based decisions that protect nature for people. Now, for the scope of application, the Act shall be enforceable for all wildlife species found in all areas of the country, including the protected areas under RA 7586 or otherwise known as NIPAST Act or National Integrated Protected Area System and the Critical Habitat Areas. Now, the NIPAST Act is a legal basis to conserve biodiversity in the country in pursuit of sustainable development through managing selected protected areas against destructive human exploitation. So here in Region 11, the protected areas that are managed according to the classifications described in Section 4 of NIPAST Act are, first, we have the Mount Apo. I guess everyone are familiar with this. It was classified as Natural Park. The Mabini in Davao de Oro and Pojada Bay in Davao Oriental, they are both classified as protected landscapes and seascapes. To implement the Wildlife Act, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, or DENR, is vested with jurisdiction over terrestrial plant and animal species, all turtles, tortoise, the dugong, and wetland species that includes crocodiles, water birds, and amphibians, while Department of Agriculture, or the DA, has jurisdiction over aquatic critical habitats and aquatic resources that includes fishes, aquatic plants, invertebrates, and marine mammals, except of course the dugong. For all species in the province of Palawan, jurisdiction is conferred to the Palawan Council for Sustainable Development or the PCSD, which is pursuant to its mandate under the RA 7611. According to Section 6 of the Act, the following activities shall be authorized by the Secretary upon proper evaluation of best available information or scientific data, showing that the activity is not detrimental to the survival of the species or subspecies involved or even their habitat, and with other certain conditions. First activity is the collection of wildlife. It may be allowed as long as the collection must be the appropriate and acceptable techniques with at least or no detrimental effects to the existing wildlife population and their habitats. There are also instances ng mga kapatid nating mga IPs gumagawa ng rituals. Minsan din, they need wildlife for the offering. So, in that case, they are allowed to collect wildlife given that those wildlife are not threatened species or belong to the red flag species. Hindi yung mga critically endangered species, kumbaga, or endangered species. Even yung vulnerable, hindi din pwede. The second activity is the possession of wildlife. No person or entity shall be allowed to possess wildlife unless such person or entity can prove financial and technical capability and facility to maintain the wildlife. Again, this wildlife must not be included to the list of threatened species. As per DAO 2017-11, for the National List of Philippine Threatened Plants, and DAO 2019-09 naman for the National List of Threatened Animals. The third activity is the collection or possession of byproducts and derivatives. Byproducts or derivatives is defined in this act as a part taken or substance extracted from wildlife, in raw or in processed form. This includes stuffed animals and herbarium specimens, skin, tusks, even the resins from various plants. In collecting or possessing byproducts and derivatives, one must acquire a permit from the DENR. And of course, one must follow a process. And included na doon ang inspection and verification kung saan kinuha yung derivatives o byproducts at kung paano ito nakuha o kung ano bang species ito galing. Next is the local transport of wildlife, byproducts, and derivatives. In transporting wildlife, byproducts, and derivatives, one must obtain a local transport permit. Bago magbigyan ng permit, kailangan munang i-inspect or verify yung wildlife or byproducts ng pinakamalapit na field office ng DNR, which is yung CENRO or Community Environment and Natural Resource Office, mula sa pinagkukunan o pinanggalingan ng wildlife. Pagkatapos nun, kukuha ng phytosanitary certificate kung plants naman yung wildlife o kaya veterinary quarantine certificate for animals naman. The fifth one is the exportation and importation of wildlife. This activity is subject to strict compliance with laws, rules, and regulations. The activity shall be allowed upon prior issuance of an export or import permit by the DNR, in accordance of course with the requirements. For the exportation of wildlife, the export permit shall be issued for specimens either covered by an import permit from DNR or other proofs of acquisition from legal sources. For species listed under the red flag species of CITES, a CITES export or import re-export permit shall be issued by the PAUP or Protected Area Wildlife Bureau ng DNR. For non-CITES specimens, prior grant of a non-CITES export or import re-export permit shall be issued by the RED or Regional Executive Director within the international airports where the wildlife specimens will exit or enter. These permits shall be issued anytime whenever needed and shall have a validity period of not more than 6 months depending upon the requirements of the shipment as determined by the DNR. Next is the introduction, reintroduction, or restocking of endemic or indigenous wildlife. These shall be allowed only for population enhancement or recovery purposes, prior to clearance from the DNR Secretary or the authorized representative. Any proposed introduction shall be subject to a scientific study which shall focus on the bioecology. The proponent shall also conduct public consultations with concerned individuals or entities, such as the NGOs, that focuses on the conservation of the related wildlife for introduction. Next activity is the introduction of exotic wildlife. No exotic species shall be introduced into the country unless a clearance from the Secretary or the authorized representative is first obtained. No exotic species will be introduced into protected areas that is covered by the RA 7586 or the NIPAST Act and to the identified or declared critical habitats. In cases where introduction is allowed, it shall be subject to environmental impact study, which shall focus on the bioecology, socioeconomic, and related aspects of the area where the species will be introduced. The proponent shall also be required to secure the prior informed consent from the local stakeholders. Now, bioprospecting is defined by the Act as the research, collection, and utilization of biological and genetic resources for purposes of applying the knowledge derived solely for commercial purposes. It is only allowed to execute such undertaking if mag-comply at mag-commit sa terms and conditions na i-impose ng DNR Secretary ang proponent which are necessary to protect biological diversity. Example nito ay yung mga pharmaceutical companies or corporations and biotechnological companies. Let's say they wants to screen or develop medicinal plants or animals for anti-cancer compounds or for treatment of other incurable diseases or illnesses. Now, before granting the necessary permit aside from complying other requirements, there should have a consultation with concerned agencies. They should have also obtained prior informed consent from the concerned indigenous cultural communities, local communities, even the management board under RA 7586 or UNIPAS Act, and other private entities. Example, kung ang specimen was collected in Mount Apo, Davao del Sur site, then there should have a consultation with the management board, protected area management board, the tribal council of Pagpuputakagpawa, the community or BLGU, and other agencies na active ang project sa Mount Apo, Davao del Sur site. Then, to effectively implement this act, the Secretary or the duly authorized representative shall issue permits, certifications, or clearances with corresponding period of validity. First one is the wildlife farm or the culture permit with a period of validity of 3 to 5 years. It is issued to individual or entity who wants to develop, operate, or maintain a wildlife breeding farm for a purpose of conservation, trade, or scientific purposes. Next one is a wildlife collector's permit. It has a period of validity for 1 to 3 years. It allows an individual or entity to take or collect certain species and quantities of wildlife from the forest for commercial breeding propagation. The third one is the gratuitous permit. It is issued to an individual, academe, research institution, or organizations who want to capture or harvest and transport the wildlife species from their natural habitat for scientific purposes. It has a period of validity for 1 year. Then the local transport permit for 1 to 3 months allows an individual or entity to transport wildlife from one region to another basta within the country lang. But if an individual or entity wants to transport wildlife from one country to another, then they must apply for the export or import or re-export permit with a validity of 1 to 6 months. These permits are only applicable to wildlife species that has not been categorized as endangered or critically endangered or vulnerable for their conservation status. These permits also may be renewed subject to the guidelines issued by the appropriate agency and upon consultation with the concerned groups. There are also fees and charges for these permits. Now, the following undertakings are prohibited or will be a violation to Wildlife Act unless otherwise allowed in accordance with this Act. Killing and destroying wildlife species except in the following instances: when it is done as part of the religious rituals of established tribal groups or indigenous cultural communities. However, the subjected wildlife must not have a red flag conservation status. Pero kung for example, yung Philippine jungle fowl or Philippine wild chickens lang na nahuhuli sa kabundukan, it's just fine kasi least concern lang naman ang conservation status niya. It wouldn't be unlawful to kill or destroy wildlife if it is afflicted with an incurable communicable disease. For instance, yung ASF outbreak or African swine flu outbreak. If the swine needs to be slaughtered as part of the mitigating measures to prevent the virus from spreading, then the authorities are allowed to do it. Next is when it is done to prevent an imminent danger to the life or limb of human being. If in a certain circumstance, when you get bitten with with a crocodile, knowingly that the crocodiles lock their jaw when they bite their prey, so to save the human's life, the crocodile have to be killed or injured. Next is when the wildlife is killed or destroyed after it has been used in authorized research or experiments. This kind of wildlife are being tested, for instance, by the pharmaceutical companies or biotechnological companies. They are screened for the development for medicines or products. Doing negative effects to the critical habitats or wildlife habitats is also prohibited to Wildlife Act. When we say critical habitats, it refers to areas outside the protected areas that is covered by the NIPAS Act but are known to be habitats of threatened species. First is dumping of waste products detrimental to the wildlife. So lahat ng klaseng waste, lalo na yung mga may halong chemicals. Second is squatting or otherwise occupying any portion of the critical habitat. Third is mineral explorations or extraction. Fourth is burning, logging, and lastly is quarrying. So apparently, these are the activities that are detrimental to the existing wildlife populations. Now, some of them are allowable to be undertaken, but only one must have to secure permits. For example, the introduction, reintroduction, or restocking of wildlife resource, the trading of wildlife, the collecting, hunting, possessing of wildlife, their byproducts and derivatives, the transporting of wildlife. So, kailangan lang ng permit, then it is allowed to be done. But when you gather or destroy activeness or nest trees or host plant, hindi talaga ito pwede and it is prohibited by the act. However, when maltreating or inflicting other injuries to the wildlife, this is allowed but in a certain condition. Now moving on to the fines and penalties once found guilty in violating Wildlife Act. First is killing and destroying. Once found guilty of killing or destroying wildlife with a red flag conservation status like critically endangered, vulnerable, or threatened, you will get imprisonment from 6 months to 12 years and penalized from 10,000 to 1 million. Example nito yung farmer from Bukidnon. Binaril at kinain niya yung Philippine eagle noong 2008. And Philippine eagle is a critically endangered bird and even protected under RA 6147. Now, the regional trial court had a verdict of penalizing him with 100,000 pesos. Now, if someone will be caught inflicting injury to the wildlife, which cripples or impairs its reproductive system, most especially to wildlife that has a conservation status of critically endangered or vulnerable or threatened ones, he or she will be imprisoned from 1 month to 6 years and will also be penalized ranging from 5,000 to 500,000. Affecting acts such as dumping waste, squatting, mineral exploration, burning, logging, and quarrying to identify wildlife critical habitats will apparently cause destruction and adverse modification to the land cover to the home of the wildlife, which consequently affects its population that may lead to extinction. So if an individual or entity will be caught to do such violation, he or she will be imprisoned from 1 month to 8 years and will be fined of 5,000 to 5 million. Trading of wildlife without permits is a violation of Wildlife Act. Lalo na kung tinitrade mo ay yung critically endangered, vulnerable, threatened, or wildlife species. Now, if found guilty for this violation, one will be imprisoned for 10 days to 4 years and will be fined ranging from 200 pesos to 300,000 pesos. While collecting, hunting, or possessing, gathering, or destroying of active nests is also a violation, especially of critically endangered, vulnerable, threatened, or other wildlife species. Example nito yung mga kumukuha ng edible nest ng swiftlets or kung sa Bisaya yung balin sa sayaw. If they were caught doing such act, they will be imprisoned from 10 days to 4 years and will be fined from 1,000 to 300,000. Then, if someone was caught maltreating and inflicting injuries to the wildlife, especially yung mga nasa red flag list at conservation status, he or she will be imprisoned from 5 days to 1 year and will be penalized from 200 pesos to 100,000. When transporting wildlife or byproducts or derivatives without permit, these wildlife derivatives or byproducts and even the paraphernalia and tools shall be ipso facto or forfeited in favor of the government. Now, if the offender is an alien or not coming from the country, he or she shall be deported after the service of sentence and payment of fines. So that's all for the Republic Act 9147 or the Philippine Wildlife Act. Thank you for listening and good day.